finding that stillness within yourself where you're clear about what your values are, where you believe that you are principled about how you put content out into the world and those principles are aligned with those values, where you feel supported in what you're doing by your team. It just means that some of that noise can be water off the duck's back because you're coming from this place of stillness in yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Rohit Bhargava and you are listening to episode 188 of the Startup Playbook podcast, a weekly series where I sit down with successful tech founders, investors and operators to unpack their journey, lessons and insights to help current and future entrepreneurs. The voice that you heard a little bit earlier was that of our guest for this episode, Jessy Wu. Jessy is a partner at AfterWork Ventures, a $20 million pre-seed and seed stage fund. Many of you will know Jessy from her posts and content on LinkedIn, and in this episode, Jessy opens up about her background in linguistics and philosophy, the value and strategy behind building her personal brand, how to build a challenger brand that competes against large incumbents, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Jessy Wu. Hi Jessy, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Pleasure to be here with you, Rohit.
I remember the first time we met was, I think I was still at AWS at the time. So it's been a long time coming. We were talking about the podcast back then as well from memory. So great to get you on the show. But Jessy, I think most people in the ecosystem know who you are, but for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, for sure. So what I do now is I'm a partner at AfterWork Ventures. We are a $20 million pre-seed and seed stage fund that invests in tech and tech-enabled companies, focusing mainly on Australia and New Zealand, although we are able to invest in companies globally as well. Before that, I'll start, a little way back. I was born in China, in Shenzhen. My parents and I migrated to New Zealand when I was 6 years old, and that's where I grew up, in Auckland. I, as a child, was a pretty precocious child. A really formative experience for me was immigrating to New Zealand at the age of 7 and losing language in some ways, losing the ability to comprehend the world around me through language and feeling very imprisoned in my incomprehension of the English language. So learning that language as a 7-year-old and learning how to re-engage with that world around me is something I think was a formative core memory of mine and was something that really drove a love for learning and also for literature and language and reading. And that's what I ended up studying at university. That's when I moved over to Australia and I studied English literature and philosophy at the ANU in a research track degree. And after that, the philosophy factory wasn't hiring, I often say. So I decided to do what a lot of people who, study a broad liberal arts degree and aren't quite sure how to apply that to a specific profession do. I spent a couple of years in strategy consulting, and that was a really great introduction to the world of business and how to think commercially and how the world worked. And 2 years into that, I had the opportunity to interview for NAB Ventures, which is a corporate VC fund investing $100 million off NAB's balance sheet into companies where there was a strategic opportunity for NAB to partner. And did that for 2 years. That was my first foray into venture capital. And I think it was around the end of my time at NAB Ventures when we first met, Rohit. 2 years into NAB Ventures, I was really looking for a peer group of people who were interested to learn about the craft of venture capital, who were hungry to improve, who were looking at deals and companies across a range of sectors and able to distill learnings from each of those investment opportunities and apply them non-linearly. And that's when I came across AfterWork Ventures, which at the time was operating as a kind of loose coalition of investors, angel investors, founders, operators, who would dial into a Zoom call on Sunday evenings to look at deals together. And I was really engaged with that community. I was learning a lot from them. I was really impressed by the diversity and rigor that was being brought to the table by these different personas jumping onto these calls. And in about the start of 2021, I decided to take that leap of faith and join Alex and Adrian as the first non-partner employee at that fund. And together we raised that $20 million fund.
Yeah, amazing. So much interesting sort of background and context that make you who you are now. But as you mentioned, moving to New Zealand was such a formative experience for you. Like I had something similar as well. I moved to, I was born in India, moved to Canada when I was 6 months old, moved to Australia. We moved back to India for a bit and then moved to Australia when I was about 6. So similar age group, but we kept moving. So we would move every sort of 12 to 18 months. I had 7 different schools by the time I got to grade 7. And, I hated that experience at that time. But again, helped form a lot of life skills in me looking back, which I guess I should be grateful for. Like you said, it was a really big inflection point for you in terms of having to, essentially recreate yourself and understand the world. What was that experience like, and how has that helped shape how you thought about your career or life since then?
Yeah, great question. And I'm really curious to hear about your experience of being a migrant and moving so many different countries as well. I think 2 things stand out for me. One is looking back at the decision that my parents made then. They were about my age, actually. They had me relatively young. So they were 32 when they moved to New Zealand, and I am 29 now. So thinking about them deciding to move their family to a new country where they didn't speak the language, where their university qualifications didn't mean very much, where they had to find a new professional network and get started as small business people. My dad became a certified financial planner, and then my mum did the CFA, and their plan was to start a financial advisory business together and essentially be a financial advisor or a wealth manager. And the thought of doing that in a new country, new culture, in a different kind of operating language, that now that I'm their age, it gives me a lot of empathy and pause for the risk that they took. And I think the fact that they were willing to do that because they backed themselves in and because they really wanted to allow their kids, me and my brother, to grow up in an educational environment that was more creative, more liberal, that, encouraged kind of play and adventure. They were wary of how rote the education system in China was, just how grueling the process of studying for high school examinations are. And I think they really wanted us to have a childhood that was more free. And so the fact that they were willing to do that for us, I think, it really does move me. I've spoken about this on a podcast before. I think the fact that I was also just so loved by my parents, my family, and they just thought I was the bee's knees. I'm the oldest grandchild, eldest daughter in my family. And I think I was born at a time where my parents and my broader family's fortunes also inflected. And so I was seen as this good luck charm for my family, and I think that has really been the wind underneath my wings for my whole life, and like a source of fortune and privilege that I try to always remember. I think the experience of being a migrant is an interesting one as well, because you do feel other in some ways, and not just because of your appearance, but also because you don't understand the norms and the cultural codes in which everyone is operating. You don't know what to wear to Mufti Day, for example, or there's the classic smelly lunch story that a lot of migrants have, which is that the food you bring to school is different. And I remember that I so desperately wanted to do as the other kids knew how to do, and I just felt so frustrated that I didn't know what the cheat codes were. Like, do you remember Scoobies at all? Yeah, okay. So like, for those who don't know, who are too young, Scoobies, these key rings that you can make out of like long strips of plastic, and you weave them together. And when I was 10 or so, that was the fad tearing through my primary school. And everyone was making these Scoobies, and it looked so fun, and they would sit in little groups at lunchtime and they would make these Scoobies and they would chat. And, it seemed like if you also did that, you would be allowed to sit with the cool girls. And I so wanted these, but I didn't know where to buy them. And I remember the worst trades I've ever made in my life was when I traded like a whole pack of gel pens that I had gotten, which would have, it would have been $15, $20 for a handful of Scoobies, which would have been cents, because I just so desperately wanted to be part of it. And I think that experience of not knowing how to comport yourself in order to fit in, wanting what the other kids have, a sense of embarrassment and confusion that your parents aren't equipping you with the right things to bring to the shared lunches to fit in, and that sense of being on the outside looking in but feeling so close to belonging, and feeling like if you just had a few cheat codes then you could figure it out and you could fit in. I think that was a formative experience as a child, and I think what that taught me is that empathy for those who feel othered, and feel othered not just because of the way they look or speak, but because of the lack of those cultural shibboleths. And I think class plays a massive role in that, right? Like, I think there's these shibboleths that come with having a certain wealth growing up, people who were skied, people who rode horses. Those were also things that were really foreign to me. And how to foster inclusivity and truly include diversity, you need to double click on the next level down behind that surface level and really think about how do you create an environment where people feel like those shibboleths are legible to them, so they know how to fit into that setting, how to integrate.
It's really fascinating you mentioned about fitting in. Like, I remember we were in Iran for almost 2 years and then moved back to Australia, and I was the weird kid who was Indian, had just come from Iran with an American accent, and just didn't make sense to anyone at all. But you also mentioned this overwhelming amount of love that your family gave you, and how much that kind of put the wind beneath your sails, as you put it. I had Daniel Petrie on recently on the podcast, and he mentioned that he didn't have that same experience from his parents, and him talking about how there's like pros and cons of things, and I guess he felt this overwhelming need to prove himself around that. I guess with your experience that you had, what do you think that enabled you to do with the love and support that your family gave you?
Yeah, I think it emboldened me to take various risks in my life. So in some ways, studying philosophy and literature, like liberal arts degree, is a bit of a risk. It doesn't lead to a classic profession, and there's a lot of immigrant children who are actually funneled into something a lot more vocational. And I think leaving NAB Ventures and tossing my lot in with a motley crew to raise our own fund when I was aged, I think, 26, that was a big risk as well. And I think it comes from a stable sense of self-worth, from not necessarily feeling like I really need to prove that worth in the eyes of my parents and my family, but that they're really excited to see me succeed and they believe me to be capable of all kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things about Asian or subcontinental families is, like you said, this expectation that you have to have a particular career path. We were just joking about this a little bit earlier about, being Indian background, you expected to be an engineer or a doctor. From what I understand, your parents were really into their humanities themselves in terms of individual interest for them, but because of the program that they had set up in China, there was massive incentives for people to move into international finance and those sort of things. I guess, is that where your parents not push but support for you, exploring some of these areas might have come from?
Yeah, I think my parents taught me a lesson that is actually relevant, very relevant to what we do today, which is the idea of leverage. They're investors themselves, wealth managers, so they understood it well. Their belief was if you do a profession like law or medicine, then generally you are compensated relative to hours worked, and you might get a very high hourly rate, but it's hard to leverage yourself, and that the way to build wealth is through owning something, through having equity ownership and making an investment, whether that be in a small business, whether that be in lots of small businesses, the way that we do through building a portfolio, or also in yourself. So they always said finance, accounting, those are things you can probably learn on the job, or you can always do some kind of diploma or professional certification to learn those things. But if you study the humanities and you understand some of the largest problems that humanity has ever tried to solve, you study literature, you understand how to resonate with people, you get an insight into the human condition because of all of these great writers and novelists and playwrights who've tried to tackle that, then you will build your understanding and your cultural capital, and use that to give yourself leverage in some way or another. And if you need to build the lever with those professional certifications or by gaining those skills, then that will be able to come at a later point in time.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about writing. From what I understand, you used to write a lot of Harry Potter fan fiction as well at school. And, you know, I think clearly from anyone that's seen your content on LinkedIn, I think you have an incredible way of storytelling through written word. I know that a lot of these things come with practice over time, but I guess for anyone listening, I feel like I speak to so many founders that talk about writing a blog post or writing more content or being more active. What are the core tenets of good storytelling when it comes to writing that you would give advice to for someone thinking about starting out in the space?
Yeah. So when people ask me for advice on this, I think the first thing, as you said, is there's no substitute for those 10,000 hours. A lot of people be like, oh, can you give me 10 tips about how I can write a better post? And I'm like, I don't know. I have been like honing this craft and really loving it for well over a decade. I don't know if I can distill the muscle memory of practice into 10 tips. But I think what I can say is to go beyond content and also think about character. And what I mean by that is I feel like character is really the thing that animates content, because people are invested in these characters, because they see themselves in the characters, because the character's story gives voice to something they have felt over time. And the character is something that can transcend the content and almost live rent-free in people's minds. I feel like that's what fan fiction is, right? All fan fiction is it's taking essentially characters, sometimes settings, plot events, but mostly characters from well-loved canons and imagining what would Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger be like if they were lawyers in a modern day setting, or if Remus Lupin was a innkeeper and Sirius Black was a reforming convict. And it puts characters in unfamiliar situations, but these characters, if they're really well developed, have this thread around how you might expect them to behave in unfamiliar situations. And lots of people who follow that character can extrapolate from that and animate these characters in their own imaginations, in their own settings. And I think that is really powerful to be able to do with your writing and with your content. And when I think about architecting characters, I think about giving them dynamism. So if, for example, you're developing your personal brand, I'll say it goes beyond the kind of content that you publish out there. It goes to what you are projecting of the kind of person you are and how dynamic you're able to make that character feel. The kind of response you want is for people to say, oh, we've never met, but I feel like I know you because I've followed you and because I've read your posts and I really resonate with this, that, and the other. And a little tactic to animate your personal brand as a character, I tell people to think about architecting a character diamond. So a character diamond is a framework where a character has 4 poles, a north, south, east, and west. And all of these poles are in slight tension, but also in interplay with one another. And if you can develop a character that has these 4 poles, then it feels like a very dynamic and deep character that people can see themselves in. So what are the poles? The north is what people see on the surface. So it's their first impression of you. The south is what lies in tension with the north and almost seems to slightly contradict the north, but is the deeper self that emerges as people get to know you better. The East is your Achilles heel. It's what makes you human. It's what may sometimes get you in trouble. It's the cross you have to bear, the monkey on your back, but makes people see you as someone who is human, who is fallible, but also something they can connect with, because you're not this perfect projection up on a pedestal. There's something that's very grounded about you. And then the West is the thing that's larger than yourself, that you stand for in the world, that people can get behind and cheer you for. So a lot of founders who say, oh, I want to build an audience, I want to start creating content, sometimes they'll rush into content without really thinking about what is the character that sits behind this content that's going to animate the content. And obviously the character should be a reflection of you. It should be a projection of facets of yourself that are real and authentic, but it can also be slightly fine-tuned in order to be coherent and easy to understand.
Yeah, love that. And I think that's a really important point and distinction to draw. I think there is this, like with any social media platform, this, I guess, perspective that all that matters is views. So the more views I get, the more viral something is, the better. But I think especially on a platform like LinkedIn, which is built for business, the whole point, as you said, of that character is how do you build that credibility, resonance, trust with the people that want to work with you. And if you're putting out content that's getting views but is counter to the type of relationship and trust that you're trying to build, it's actually doing you a disservice rather than helping you.
Yeah. And also I think you can have both, right? Because I think when it comes to views, people do really want to hear from people rather than brands. It's quite hard for company pages to have cut through. I think people just dismiss company pages. They don't feel like there's a person behind it. They just feel it's a social media manager kind of turning the handle. Whereas people want to connect with other people. They want to hear from other people. So I was looking at my impressions on LinkedIn over the last year, and I think it comes in at about 3.5 million. And on posts, and if you look at the LinkedIn CPM, cost per impression, on paid LinkedIn posts, it's about $20 per 1,000. So 3.5 million views, that would be about $70,000 if you were to pay to sponsor your posts to get that number of views. So there's, I think, organic content is really underpriced inventory on LinkedIn in particular, where I'm only posting 1, maybe 2 times a week. I'm writing these during my commute, or I'm coming up with a thought in the shower and then refining it a little bit afterwards. It doesn't take that much time, but the amount of impressions you can get on organic content that is connecting with people is really high. And then, yeah, to your point about not just churning out content, I feel like especially in this AI era where ChatGPT is so good at writing things that seem credible, plausible, injecting your content with that character and making it feel like there is a broader arc or journey that content is connecting to is how you make your content more defensible.
Yeah. And I think you raised another point as well in terms of frequency, thought, content plan. When it comes to a lot of this, founders are notoriously busy and have a million things on their plate. And they always, a lot of my conversations with them is, I know this is important, I know I should do it, but I just can't make the time for it. How much, I know you've got a flat out schedule with 29 portfolio companies that you're supporting, continuing to meet with companies. How do you think about, is there a plan and strategy? Do you have forward planning in terms of the type of content that you're going to write, or is it literally you're on the train and just whatever's sort of coming to mind is what you sort of put out there?
Yeah, I think as with all things, it's a muscle, right? So expecting that first post to come easily is almost unrealistic, but your 10th post, your 20th post will come a lot faster than your first post. And I often say to people, in some ways, your first post is your least important post, because that's when you likely have the least number of followers and you have no track record of posting. So not many people are going to see your first post. Your 10th post hopefully has a much larger audience. So just post something. Get that content out there, overcome any anxiety or nerves around having the audacity to be somebody who creates content on the internet, and go from there. I think when it comes to forward planning, what I found helpful is, one, coming up with a few formats that you can quite consistently write against, and for that format to support other aspects of what you do or what you're trying to achieve. If, for example, you are a founder of a business that has a B2B product and you need to become credible or an authority in productivity or procurement or treasury management or something like that. Pick a format that is able to dispel myths about that. People find that interesting because it's a challenger brand approach to things, or sharing news items about those things, but unpacking the news and making it bite-sized so people can be like, oh, that's a good explication of something I've seen on the headlines. I'm going to store that and use that little factoid somewhere else, and it'll make me seem knowledgeable. And then that means that when that happens, for example, when there's a complicated lawsuit about XYZ, you're like, oh, well, I have a format that I distill this breaking news into something digestible, and then that's probably easier than coming up with that format from scratch.
Yeah, and I think in terms of content ideas as well, like you said, I feel like a lot of it is just a muscle. So I think the more you do it, the more the content ideas will come out. For me personally, I just have a note section on my phone where anytime something comes in my mind, I'll drop it in. And there's a lot of things that I haven't either touched or will at some point get to. But I think other good sources are even just looking at comments and what other people are posting up in YouTube videos or those sort of things of other people that you sort of look up to, or are just people that you respect in the industry.
Yeah.
You're just answering people's questions and trying to provide value that way.
I think finding a community of people who are also creating content and taking it relatively seriously can be quite helpful. I'm part of a WhatsApp group chat. It has people in the Australian tech ecosystem who take it fairly seriously, like Casey Flint is in it, Batco from StartMate, Tom Elder and Alex Brogan, who do it in a more professional way. And we are both tactical and strategic. People will share tactical feedback on how to optimize posts for the algorithm, how to write a better hook, time of day, what formats like carousels versus picture for posts are in and out of favor with the algorithm. But then people will also share things like, oh, what's your process for developing content? And different people do it in different ways. Like Tommy Elder, who quit his job at Atlassian in order to take content creation and his newsletter full time. He, I think, has a big Kanban board where he'll write an idea and he'll move it along the Kanban board as he refines it from drafting through to ready to post. And other people have different compartmentalized time of days where they develop content. So getting insight and also motivation from others who are doing something similar can be really helpful.
We're going to take a very quick break from this podcast to talk about an important issue, which is the growth of your business. Specifically, how long sales cycles when selling to large enterprise customers can slow down progress for so many startups. Unfortunately, a portion of this is out of your control, but something you can do to accelerate your sales cycles and sell to bigger customers is to demonstrate your security compliance with standards like ISO 27001 or SOC 2. The problem is that achieving compliance can be a big distraction and a large financial and operational drain for your company. Thankfully, our partners for the show, Vanta, can help with this. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance, getting you audit ready quickly and saving you up to 85% of associated costs. And Vanta scales with your business, helping you continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. There are over 7,000 fast-growing companies like Atlassian and Dovetail that use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. They've been supporters of the show for a while now and are doubling down in their support for our community by offering $1,000 US off their plans. To access this exclusive offer, head over to vanta.com/playbook. That's VANTA.com/playbook. All right, let's get back to this episode. You mentioned something a little bit earlier, which I found fascinating, which is just about who's the character that you want to be online. What's Jessy Wu's character?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. So I think how I probably think about it is the North is, intelligent, curious, confident. The South is warm, friendly, humorous, quirky. The East, which is my Achilles heel and what makes me human, is probably something around being a challenger. So headstrong, maybe conflict prone, hot-headed. That can sometimes get me in trouble. And then the West, which is the things that I stand for that are larger than myself, it's probably my values. So things like being a door opener, not a gatekeeper, things like speaking truth, things like courage, but where that courage really comes from a place of heart and compassion. Yeah, that's something I didn't necessarily architect top down and then write all of my content against that character diamond. but it's something that I think has taken shape as I found my voice as a creator and have a brand as an investor of a new challenger fund moving through this ecosystem that also feels like it's a fairly authentic projection of myself. And I think that north-south of, I want my content to come across as thoughtful, considered, but I also don't want it to come across as super didactic and super unapproachable and super holier than thou and purport to be this like ultimate authority on anything. So the way that I try to disarm some of that impression is with that south, where it's about being quite quirky, quite funny. I've previously used the word unhinged to describe aspects of my content and really having that warmth and groundedness come through.
You spoke about getting into trouble or things kind of getting you into trouble. And, I think the really fascinating part, I think your bravery and courage to speak up about things definitely shines through and is something that everyone has to say about the content that you put out. I spoke to Fab, who's one of the LPs, and also Mike Forster as well. Mm-hmm. And, I think there's always a interesting, and I guess you're an individual contributor to a fund and you have your own personal views on things. Mm-hmm. When you become partner and you're part of a larger organization as well, there's always that balance of where is the line, if there is a line, and what does that sort of look like? I guess, how have you found that balance for yourself and with the fund? Because obviously, as you mentioned, the views and impressions that you get are hugely helpful. What have you had to think about a balance on the other side to make sure that it doesn't tip the other way?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in some ways, being a challenger brand as an individual and operating an emerging fund, there's quite a strong synergy in what you're trying to do. Challenger brands, I was rereading a little bit about this in preparation, and challenger brands, there's a quote which is, it's not so much about their size, it's about their attitude, and that attitude is normally one of righteous indignation, which I found funny. So if you think about the kind of direct-to-consumer challenger brands that have been really successful over the years, it's things like Dollar Shave Club, Warby Parker and Bailey Nelson for glasses, Koala Mattress and Casper for mattresses. And the attitude they take is one of, the incumbents have been pulling the wool over your eyes for a really long time, and they are charging you through the nose, and we're here to tell you how things really operate, and we're going to pass a lot of that margin through to you. So Warby Parker was disrupting Luxottica, which is a global company that is actually the supplier behind a lot of the fashion brands like Dior, Prada, Ray-Bans. All of those glasses, they create the illusion of choice, but they're actually all just manufactured by Luxottica. And because of the tie-up they have, they are really pressing their suppliers, but also charging $300 for what is essentially a piece of glass and a piece of plastic. And Warby Parker was able to come in with that challenger narrative and gain market share by resonating with customers. And I think when you can make your brand story align with the customer story of your ICP, your prospective customers, then that becomes a really magical moment and those customers become advocates for you. So how we thought about it when we were coming to market with this kind of small fund, we didn't even know how large it was going to be at the time because we were raising it. We knew that we had to create a challenger brand that was happy to zig where others zagged. And the challenger brand has to act like a challenger, not like a miniature version of an incumbent. So the opportunity we saw in 2021, coming into VC where there's the Blackbird, Airtree, Square Pegs of the world who already have a lot of mental availability, great portfolios, an amazing track record. To cut through that, we knew we had to say something a little bit different rather than just be a subscale version of those big three. So what was that? I think what we said was VC, it makes itself out to be really unassailable in terms of understanding how they make decisions. And there's a lot of mystique around how founders are picked and what the process is. There's mystery around the investment decision making, the investment process, and a lot of people feel like they're on the outside looking in, where this is a really exciting thing. It's in the headlines. It's very buzzy, but they don't necessarily understand how the sausage is made. And there's a curiosity to learn more. And some of this was organic rather than planned, but we were like, what if we made our deal flow calls on Zoom on a Sunday evening, and we made them open to a broad group of people so everyone could see how we're discussing and dissecting companies and deals? And what if we published investment notes that were a lot more detailed than some of the marketing style pieces that we're seeing out there, where we're actually articulating the concerns we had about the company and the questions we had for the team and how we built conviction? What if we put out a resource on how to break into VC, which is laying out all of the questions that get asked in interviews and the resources to prepare for those things? What if we were a little bit more nimble and dynamic and brought a bit of personality and challenge? Like, I hope not to use the language of picking fights, but, bring a little bit of sharpness and heat to some of the perhaps mutual back-patting that happens in the industry, and stand for something that's a little bit more strident and memorable. So I think some of that you do through the brand, but also some of it is weird coming from a brand, so you do it from an individual account. And I think that's part of how I think AfterWork has been able to gain mental availability. We grew our presence to, I think we're the 5th most followed VC fund on LinkedIn after Blackbird, Airtree, Squarepeg, and Investable. So Franco does a really great job at Investable. And we have been able to get our way into, for example, or write-ups alongside much larger funds than us, because the thinking will be, okay, we have Squarepeg and Blackbird represented, but we should have an emerging fund represented as well. Who's an emerging fund? And you want to be the one that comes to mind. And of course, you want to be respectable. You want to be respectful. You want to be credible. But in some ways, being a miniature version of a large fund isn't going to make you memorable enough to be that other slot on a VC fund. So that's something that, is a deliberate strategy. But you're right, to the point you made earlier about Fab and Mike, there can be blowback from being too pointed, and maybe from being political even. It can be a little bit polarizing. So especially when you have a lot of stakeholders and a large portfolio and you're sector agnostic, so you want to meet as many people as possible, there's a constant learning about how to thread that needle so that you can be a little bit pointed, a little bit contentious, but hopefully not be putting people offside. And don't purport to have nailed it 100% of the time, but I think it's really thinking about, am I doing this from a place of wanting to push the conversation forward in a constructive way, or am I really bringing a personal frustration or emotion into it?
It's interesting because everyone that I spoke to as part of the research process, as an interview, mentioned that. I spoke to Daniel Wang, who was your housemate for a while. He did mention that you couldn't stack dishwashers to save your life, but he did mention, and as I said, everyone mentioned this about, obviously you have this very public persona, but privately you're a lot more introspective and considered with those sort of things. I guess, how do you understand that it's part of a strategy and part of the bigger picture? How do you personally handle the blowback or all of the negatives that come with that? Because I think that's a large part of what holds a lot of people back from putting out content. Is it's difficult for me to put myself out there. What will people think? What if people don't like it? What if people have a negative view of me? How have you handled that for yourself?
It's a really interesting question, and it's something that I'm definitely not immune from, and something that I've struggled with. If there's been a piece of content that has put people offside and that causes negative reverberations for myself and for the fund, it is definitely something to sit with and really introspect on. And there are consequences, and sometimes things can escalate and actually get out of your control or go far beyond what you initially predicted would occur. And that's the nature of social media, right? If something gets large enough, you're actually being shown to a lot of people, 200,000 impressions on some posts, right? So you're going to attract people who really disagree with you and probably don't know you. So haven't seen your content before, don't have any connection to this character diamond you've painstakingly architected. So yes, I think that founders who want to put themselves out there have to be prepared for the slings and arrows and need to have a maybe groundedness and stillness in themselves and maybe surety in themselves to be able to stomach it. I think once again, it is probably a muscle, so it gets easier over time. But two, I think finding that stillness within yourself where you're clear about what your values are, where you believe that you are principled about how you put content out into the world and those principles are aligned with those values, where you feel supported in what you're doing by your team. It just means that some of that noise can be water off the duck's back because you're coming from this place of stillness in yourself.
I love that advice. And like you said, it is a muscle. I mean, I remember when I first launched the podcast 7.5 years ago, would get some really interesting feedback from people. And, personally, I could have 10, 20 amazing, really warm, nice messages. And then the one message that has something negative really sticks with you. And for me, it's stuck in my mind for days on end. Are there any sort of tactics that you have or kind of things that you've used to find that stillness in yourself or to find that separation between negative comments and being able to move on?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it still can rattle me, for sure. Both the things that you hear directly, but also even just the flutters that you might become aware of. I think that the support of people around you to really say, hey, look, I see that you're over-rotating on this piece of negative feedback you've received, but you're really discounting all of the positives, and somebody who can take you from that place of rattledness to a place of groundedness, I think that's really great. But yeah, I don't really have the full answer either. How about you? How have you found it putting yourself out there a lot?
Probably similar to you. I think it's really helpful. I think you learn to detach yourself a little bit from that. So same thing I remember I used to religiously go in every day and check the download numbers. If it hadn't grown by a certain amount, I would feel awful about it. And if it was better than I thought, then I'd feel okay for a second and move on. But then just learning to trust the process of bringing myself back to what am I doing this for? I'm doing this because I want to do this for 10 years and just see what happens was always the goal. And so it doesn't matter what happens week to week. As long as I put out great content, it will out. But I think in terms of the negative feedback specifically, I think I've been very lucky to have some amazing friends that I'm very open with. So I think it's hard for people to support you if they don't know what's going on. And so just learning to be more open and vocal about if you are struggling with something or something's happened. And for people, like you said, to point that out and just go, hey, like, you're spinning. Here's a bigger picture around this and whatever. It still takes time. And like you said, still rattles you. But I think it's helpful to have that context and that perspective outside of just yourself as well. You would have heard me say many times on this podcast before that I am such a big believer in surrounding yourself with the right people. And that's why I'm delighted to partner with Sender. Sender is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia, catering to all stages of your business life. If you're busy running a startup, you don't always have the time to balance your own books or do forecasts, and instead you can fully outsource your finance function to give you the time, energy, and resources that you need back to do what you do best, which is growing your business. They have a dedicated focus on founders, funders, and startups, and have an experienced team that can help you with everything from managing your tax to balancing your books to even helping with your exit strategy. I trust and use them with all of my businesses and can't recommend them highly enough. To find out more or to speak to Gareth and the team, head over to sender.com. That's SCENDAR.com. All right, let's get back to this episode. Speaking of even just that strategy that you mentioned around the challenger brand that AfterWork has built up and that real community feel, how deliberate was that strategy of the way that you thought about doing those IC meetings? Was that something that came first and the rest came beyond that? Or was that, as you said, part of the strategy of kind of thinking about how do we do this differently based on how people view the world of VC?
It's something that started organically and started actually long before I was involved in AfterWork, which is there was a group of people who were doing angel investing and they thought they could really extend themselves and leverage themselves by doing it collectively. So 2 distinct groups of angel investors, Dave, Mike and Adam, were friends from New Zealand, and then Alex and Adrian were best friends from Perth, and they were connected by a founder who they were both due diligencing, and the founder has said, you're both asking me these questions and they're very rigorous for the size of check you want to write. Why don't I introduce you to each other and you can talk about it? And I think that was the beginning of a really productive dialogue on both sides, and they saw that they were seeing more deals than they otherwise would have, and they had better minds around the table to think about those deals. And that was the kernel that grew into the LP base for the $1 million proof of concept fund that the 5 of them raised. And that group of thought partners grew to about 20 in size. And that was the community that I joined in 2020. And what the founders found at the time is that this Rolodex was really animating the VC flywheel. So this group of people were referring deals from their personal and professional networks, and they were referring founders really early on in the journey. They were helping to accelerate to a robust understanding of different business models and sectors. And then after investment, they were rolling up their sleeves and leaning in to make introductions or give strategic guidance on the companies, and that was creating net promoters, and that would re-energize the flywheel. And that was what I was really captivated by. I saw this opportunity to give a community of founders and operators what they were really interested in, which is an insight into VC, a cohort of people to be in dialogue with and learn and grow alongside, a feeling of companionship at a time where people were feeling very isolated because of the pandemic, and really make that the foundation of something that's also energizing the VC business model and flywheel. So then as we launched into the world and said hello world and set off on raising this $20 million professional sized fund, it became a more intentional strategy to grow that community. We grew it to about 100 people, and that's when Fab joined the community as well, and really to architect the community around that flywheel, but also to create memorable events for that community to come together. And I think what I will say that as a community builder, the modality of how we've run that community has had to evolve over time as well, based on people's interests waxing and waning. So, for example, at the beginning during COVID, a lot of it was virtual, and there was a lot of interest in these Zoom calls and these gather town social virtual meetups and coffee roulettes and that kind of thing. But then after the pandemic, people were like, I never want to be on a Zoom party again. And the engagement in those Sunday evening calls started to peter out, and they were probably less useful and less interesting, I guess, because less people were joining. So then something that I initiated last year was a way to bring people together in a really memorable, bespoke, curated way in person with the One Conversation dinner party series that we pioneered, which is when we invite 12 people to come around for a meal, normally a dinner, and we curate that group to all have diverse, divergent perspectives on a central topic. And the topic can be something like longevity, or it can be something like what makes a city, or it can be something quite abstract like abundance or mimetic desire. And these are all topics that we've done. And then we write a conversational menu that acts as a provocation or a prompt for different conversations for the entree and main dessert. And then we facilitate this conversation where we're all talking about the central topic, and there's this real permission and encouragement to go deep on this topic and be quite nerdy and pull on different threads. And that has become a more important modality of how we engage that community over time. So I think, community building is not a playbook. It's not a static thing. You have to constantly be evolving that strategy of what it means to be a community-powered VC fund.
Yeah, I agree. Like similarly to a dinner, a slightly different style where we'll bring together generally 20 to 25 people, which will be a mixture of our portfolio and just angels in our network and just other awesome people. We take the approach of just no topic, no agenda, just free for all, but just pulling together a room full of awesome people to connect and join the dots. A lot of them haven't met each other. And I think it's especially beneficial for our portfolio founders where there's a way for them to have 15, 20 different conversations that otherwise just take a ton of time to build. But yeah, big advocate for that sort of community building. I think something else that I wanted to pull on that you mentioned a little bit earlier was part of your challenger strategy on the content side was putting heat into the market in, as you said, an industry where there's generally a lot of back padding that goes on. You know, we were speaking before we put on the podcast about the importance for both AfterWork and also for Playbook Ventures in being able to co-invest alongside great parties and having those relationships. You know, I think anyone that knows you for being very warm and building really great, authentic relationships with people. But again, how do you find that balance from putting the heat on something where there's often not being there to then also being able to build those really strong relationships to then be able to co-invest or lean on other partners as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and don't purport to have all the answers. It's very much a work in progress. I think my thinking about courage has evolved over time. I think it is a coincidence, but I find it very interesting that courage, if you break up that word, is core, which is where it's etymologically derived from. It's the Latin and French word for heart, and then it's rage, which is a coincidence that it's part of courage. That word is not linked etymologically to the word for rage or anger. But I think courage without heart is just rage, right? And that's a little mantra that I have, which is when you bring that heat, are you standing for that West, for something larger than yourself, for a core value, a core way that you want to turn up in this world? Or are you acting out from a place of frustration or anger or whatever else is happening to you that day? You got a parking ticket, so you want to take it out on someone. And I think that self-awareness is really, really key, because I think people can read. People are pretty literate about social media these days, right? People can read where it's coming from a place of. And I think if they see that it's coming from a place of heart and you're very open to a productive dialogue about things, and that in person you're very happy to have a productive conversation, then I think you can bring heat in online forums and still have really great relationships. But yeah, if that self-awareness isn't there on any given day, and actually you were pissed that you got a parking ticket and you took it out on something where there was maybe a sliver of something to call out, but actually just a projection, then I think people can read that too. So I think it comes back to being really aware of the way that you move through the world, and clear thinking and emotional regulation. Yeah,
which is easier said than done. Jessy, maybe finally, again, I think something that doesn't really get spoken about, as you referenced earlier, is just the decision-making process that happens behind the doors for a lot of founders. You know, founders have, unfortunately, the sample size of one. They just have their own experience of their company pitching to investors and waiting to hear back from them. And there's a lot that goes into decision-making around funds that isn't privy for a lot of founders. You know, something else we were speaking about is it's something that we have to consider for a syndicate structure where, you know, essentially when we're making an investment, I'm personally investing in those deals, but then we have to offer that out to our investors and make sure that there's enough interest from them to buy into a particular deal. And the risk could be, I have a deal that I love and a founder that I love, but is very contrasting to anything else that the rest of the syndicate offers. And so we have to find that right balance for ourselves as well. I know we have a shared company in our portfolio, Chris Withers from Clickit.
And Everlab as well.
I'd just love to understand it from an AfterWork perspective, especially since you do take a really community-based TD approach as well. How do you think about those deals and investments, and how do you find that balance for yourself?
Yeah, curious to double click on the question. Do you mean the decision-making around those deals in particular, or?
Yeah, I think we were speaking a little bit earlier before we put on the microphone about how you have to be conscious in the market if we're not we're not in a place, and I assume AfterWork isn't in a place to take up an entire round on its own. So making sure that there is the right kernels of overlap with other funds for them wanting to get involved, for them to be able to raise the entire round and be able to raise subsequent rounds of capital.
Yeah. I think things that are maybe helpful for founders listening to demystify is some of the constraints that funds are subject to when it comes to executing against their investment mandate and delivering for their LPs. That is not always that apparent in the marketing and content that VCs put out. One is that your fund size is your fund strategy. So we're trying to deliver multiples of our fund, right? A lot of VC funds in their investment memos say they're targeting a 4x return. So for a $20 million fund, we're hoping to turn that into $80 million and have that kind of $60 million of upside that we're delivering for our LPs. In order to return the fund, you can kind of figure it out. It's just a product of how much they invest and how much that position needs to be worth in the terminus for them to return that fund. And it's worth noting that for a larger fund, for example, a $500 million fund, the bar to return the fund is a lot higher, right? It's just objectively much harder to turn $1 billion into $4 billion than it is to turn $20 million into $80 million. And sometimes that means that the larger funds are really looking for the extreme of outlier outcomes. So I think for a fund, for a $500 million fund, you need a $4 billion outcome to return that fund. And that means that company has to be extremely ambitious to grow very fast and very capital hungry as well to keep taking on that capital and chasing such a large TAM that it can support that kind of outcome. For a small fund, the calculus changes a little bit. In order to return the fund, we don't necessarily need a $4 billion outcome. Often small funds can be returned with a $500 million outcome, a $1 billion outcome. If it's a really early stage investment and the funds are investing at pre-seed at a sub $5 million valuation, even a $100, $200 million trade sale could be a really great outcome for the fund and its LPs. So I think that's something worth keeping in mind when talking to different fund sizes, and that tends to be also why smaller funds co-invest together, because they have a similar fund size, therefore they have a similar strategy and a similar expected return from a given company. I think the other thing to note is just financing risk as a concept. So financing risk, when we talk about it in our IC and decision-making forum, is about, can this company attract future funding and attract the kind of capital it needs to reach its terminal valuation. Sometimes financing risk can be introduced if, for example, the cap table is broken, i.e. if, advisor or accelerator owns too much of the company and the founder doesn't have sufficient equity in the company to be motivated through many, many rounds of funding. And the benchmark there is the founding team should own at least 50% of the company after Series A. But it can also be introduced if you're sitting there thinking, this idea is just so wild that we don't know if there's going to be enough people who see the reason in the madness fast enough for them to raise the size of Series A, Series B that they need to continue on this path. So there's the phrase that gets thrown around, which is you want to be a contrarian investor, you need to be contrarian but right. As a small fund that doesn't have the ability to, one, take up the whole round, and two, support the founder through multiple rounds off the basis of their conviction alone, it actually means that there's a narrow window in which you can be contrarian, but you very quickly need that company to have the proof points to convince people outside of that initial range to back the company in. So that's why sometimes consensus bets can get backed, because you might be like, well, this isn't as crazy, and maybe the expected outcome at the very end is smaller, but this is a very credible founder. It's a very sound idea. It likely has product market fit because it's replacing something that already exists and doing it better. And this founder is the kind of founder who's going to be able to raise a seed and raise a Series A because they're disciplined and they have the right credentials. Yeah, so I think those are just dynamics that it helps to be alive to.
Jessy, I can talk to you about fundraising investment strategy all day, but before we wrap up, because I know that you do have to head off to another meeting, I just wanted to talk about the important work that you and a couple of really important people are doing with Grapevine. Do you want to share and elaborate more on that?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks for the opportunity. Grapevine is an initiative started by some founders, operators, investors within the Australian tech ecosystem that is looking to bring awareness and pragmatic discourse around abuses of power in the tech ecosystem. And that abuse of power can sometimes manifest as bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, discrimination, and bias. And the reason we're bringing this conversation is not because we think the tech sector is hopelessly behind or less progressive than other sectors. In some ways, we think the tech ecosystem is fantastic. It has a lot of progressive ideals. It is nimble and it is open to change. But we also identify that, especially in the world of venture-backed startups, there are some structural vulnerabilities that can leave itself open to abuses of power. One of them is that often founders are inexperienced people managers, so don't necessarily have an experience of implementing an empowered HR team and a set of policies around HR, which can leave the door open to inappropriate behavior and lack of professionalism in the workplace. It's also an acknowledgement of how in venture-backed startups, the founder and the founding team looms so large. They are the pillar of the whole company. The company's founding story is tied up in the founder's story. They have the relationship with a lot of stakeholders, including investors. So the founder is sometimes knowingly or unknowingly able to perpetuate those abuses of power and not have accountability mechanisms such as an empowered HR department, for example, to hold them accountable. So what Grapevine does is it's sharing de-identified stories submitted by real people within this ecosystem, highlighting instances where they have experienced an abuse of power, and then fairly non-judgmentally providing some practical guidance around actions that people with power explicitly, bystanders, and the people affected by that event can react. And I think the theory of change is that we are raising consciousness, we're starting this conversation, we're shining a light, but we're doing it in a way that very much acknowledges that people are capable of change, and that if we are aware of these things, then we're equipped with the ways to introspect and think about when we may ourselves unwittingly perpetuate or be a bystander to these abuses of power, but also collectively be armed as an ecosystem to do better.
And I think the important distinction to draw is here, no one expects any of these sort of things to happen, and every founder will say, I'm never going to build a culture like that where we allow those sort of things. But as you said, especially when things scale and it's things evolve and things sometimes you're just unaware of sort of happening internally. And I think, like you said, it's just good to be prepared ahead of time to just know in those particular situations, if they happen, how do you need to handle that, or even just what are policies that you can put in place to get ahead of that time.
Yeah, and recently there's been new legislation introduced that means that companies actually have a positive duty to prevent bullying and harassment in the workplace, which is a change from previous obligations. And I think startups in particular may not have the resources to respond to having that positive duty. So what Grapevine is trying to do is it's trying to arm people with those resources, best practice policies, best practice recourse for when things are reported, and lift the standard together.
Amazing. Jessy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This is well worth the wait of getting you on. Thank you for being so open with all of your experiences and just delivering an absolute masterclass on personal branding and even how to build a challenger brand. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, sure. So if you're a founder of a pre-seed, seed stage company and you are looking for venture investment, AfterWork's doors are open. We're actively investing. So AfterWork.VC is the website. And then I'm always available on LinkedIn and email. It's Jessy@AfterWork.VC.
Perfect. I will make sure we add those notes into the show notes.
Awesome.
Jessy, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, fantastic.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 188 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and as always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.